We got a lot of talking to do today, so I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. I'm sure people will keep joining over the next few minutes, but they won't miss these super important bits. So welcome to YIMBY Action's conversation on anti-racism and urbanism. YIMBY Action is a network of pro-housing activists fighting for more inclusive housing policies. We drive policy change to increase the supply of housing at all levels and bring down the cost of living and opportunity for cities and towns. My name is Ernest Brown, and it's my privilege to serve as YIMBY Action's board chair. If what you hear today resonates with you, please consider becoming a member at yimbyaction.org/join. YIMBY Action is hosting this series of conversations in an exercise to take to heart the message of the recent uprisings. Our hope is that we can elevate ideas and practices that will help us reimagine how we shape cities and to whose benefit we create that change. We hope this series can help us explore the concept of anti-racism in urbanism. How can the policies of urbanism become a force that tears down institutional racism and reduces the racial wealth gap? How does the urbanist movement address its own history and current participation in upholding white supremacy? We're not going to answer all those questions today, but we hope to get started down this path. And today we've got two guests to help us do that, Andre Perry and June Grant. And we're going to hear from Andre first. Andre Perry is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings and a scholar in residence at American University. He's the author of the new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Andre, do you want to kick us off with your presentation?
Yes. Hey, well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me. This is an exciting opportunity for me to be on the West Coast, so to speak. I'm always happy to be out there. I have a new book, as was stated, Know Your Price, and I'm going to present some of the findings of that that served as the anchor for the book. That you will see as soon as I get here. Slideshow, play from, bear with me. So, can you see my slide? Everything's okay. Very good. So I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution. I study Black majority cities. And as you can see, there are 1,200 all throughout the United States. Most are in the South. Historically, as most people know, Oakland is probably one of the proudest, most notable Black majority cities of the past that is no longer. But it is part of our analysis because we do look at metro areas. But I'm going to start with my home in my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is where I was raised. As the story goes, my brother and I, after I was born in the hospital, there was a deal made by this woman in the upper right-hand corner. I call her mom. Her name is Elsie Boyd. There was a deal made between Elsie Boyd and my maternal grandmother that when I was born, I would be taken and I would live with Elsie Boyd in that house at 1320 Hill Avenue. The reason being, my mother was poor. She already had a child, my older brother. She was probably abused. So the deal was made that I would be essentially informally adopted. Along the way, my brother came, but throughout my time there, she raised about 12 to 15 kids of varying durations, some for a few weeks, some for a few months, other for years. I'd stayed till I graduated from high school. The reason being, my father, who's pictured here, he was drug addicted. He was a heroin addict. He eventually was in and out of prison, and he was eventually killed in prison. But the narrative was that he was a violent person, and he did do violent deeds. But the narrative was that he caused his own problems. If he would have only stayed out of trouble, he would never end up in jail, and he would never end up dead. So I wanted to contextualize that before I get into this discussion about housing. A lot of people will know that homes in Black neighborhoods are priced lower, but I just want to give people some context. As you can see here on the x-axis, you see communities where the percent of the population, or the percent of the population is Black. And as you can see on the y-axis, you have the actual price of the home. So in areas where the percent of the Black population, the share of the Black population is less than 1%, homes are about 340,000, compared to those where the share of the Black population is 50% or higher. It's about 184 $100,000. A lot of people will say that's because of education, that's because of crime, that's because of individual behaviors of the people in them. But those are things we can control for. So, and that's what I did. I looked at the absolute price differences, so what you saw there, but then I controlled for structural characteristics. So I wanted to get an apples to apples comparison between 2-bedroom homes in a Black neighborhood compared to essentially the same home in a white neighborhood. But we also can control for neighborhood amenities. We control for education, crime, walkability, and all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found pretty much astounds that homes in Black neighborhoods are devalued or undervalued by 23%, about 48,000 per home. That's 156 billion in lost equity in Black neighborhoods. And you can see devaluation occurring all over the United States, including in your metro area. And I'll just show what it is in Oakland. The percent difference is about 27%, amounting to a loss of $164,000 in lost equity. Here you can see that devaluation is occurring everywhere. I should have pointed out wherever you see a magenta circle, that's where devaluation is occurring. Wherever you see a green circle, that's where homes are appreciating in value in Black neighborhoods. So there are places where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher, and you can see them here. There are fewer, much fewer number of them. The greater trend is there's devaluation. But I want to show that there's 156 billion in lost equity. I just want to put this in perspective. It would have, so the same amount of if there were 4.4 million Black-owned businesses, it would have paid for that amount based on the average amount Black people use to start up their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount of a four-year degree. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan nearly 3,000 times over. It nearly would have covered all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. But reason why I say this, my father died an opioid addict. And in my book, I went to the areas where he lived. And he lived in areas where there was significant housing devaluation. And it is clear to me that if he lived in a white neighborhood, he would have better educational services, better social services. He would have had better schools. He would have had the ability to purchase treatment for his addiction. If he were white and living in a white neighborhood, he would never ended up in jail and never ended up dying in jail. And I bring that up to say that this housing devaluation, it robs us of the resources needed to lift ourselves up. And it leads me to this, something I say all the time. There's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. There's a white supremacist myth that says that the conditions and of Black cities and neighborhoods are a direct result of the people in them. No, what is really happening is that policies are extracting wealth and opportunity from Black people every day. I just want to play this one clip of me testifying. Now, if there's one thing that we know, that there is housing discrimination throughout the United States. I had to testify on Capitol Hill with the appraisal community. I just want you to see what we're up against when it comes to dealing with discrimination in housing.
If you think Black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel. If you think that, for fear that I'm not communicating well, if you think that Black people are not being discriminated against when their property is being appraised, if you think they're not being discriminated against, kindly raise your hand. Okay, hands now, we're getting some consternation, I see.
Wow, so, I brought that up because there is not a lot of incentive for people to change. So we're going to have to demand change. I just want to be clear with that. And briefly, I'm just going to go over another facet of the research behind the book. As we know, Black people represent about 13% of the population, but only 4% of the nation's business owners. I'm going to talk through one of the studies that undergirded the book. Here's a restaurant owner in Pittsburgh, Dorian Moorfield, who owns Grandma B's in Pittsburgh. Here he's holding up a breakfast steak. He's proud of the service, the food, and it's reflected in his Yelp review. It generally gets high Yelp reviews, 4.64 out of 5 when we did this study. And he's in an area that's rapidly gentrifying. In 2010, it was 99% Black. Since then, it's become 80% Black. So it's rapidly gentrifying. A lot of this data I'm going to show is in this report, the evaluation of business in Black communities. Again, we know that Black business owners are suffering from systemic discrimination. Only 1% of Black owners received loans in their founding compared to 7% of white entrepreneurs. Black entrepreneurs are denied bank loans more than twice as often as their white peers. People of color pay higher interest rates. About half of Black businesses closed after the Great Recession. And then most recently, 95% of Black-owned businesses did not receive PPP loans as part of CARES Act. So this is a problem. But what I wanted to do to show that this is not about quality. Our businesses are of quality. So I did the same thing I did in housing. We looked at business revenue. So we capture business revenue. We scraped all the Yelp data just to get a sense of business quality in the hood. So we scraped all the Yelp data, and we also controlled for neighborhood conditions. So buying power, education, all those things, so we could get an apples to apples comparison of businesses. And what we found may surprise some. Minority-owned businesses are rated just as highly or higher than white-owned businesses. I should say businesses owned by people of color are rated higher than their white counterparts. But we get less revenue and less reviews, largely because white people are deciding not to patronize quality businesses in Black neighborhoods. And you can see here, minority businesses, as the percent of the community increases in Blackness, it still maintains higher Yelp reviews than other businesses, but the number actually go down. And I'll just say that this is costing businesses in Black community close upwards of $4 billion in lost revenue. And I brought this up to say what our elders used to say all the time: our ice is just as cold. They knew that if you don't utilize quality in the hood, you distort the market in a way that suppresses economic growth. They knew that our businesses are just as good, if not better. What they're lacking is investment. And so I'm going to close there because I want to get into this conversation, but my book, Know Your Price, there are several different assets I look at, not just businesses. I look at real estate development. I look at culture. I look at housing, obviously, education. And what's amazing is that our ice is just as cold, if not colder. In all of these cases, that our businesses are just as good, our homes are just as good, our areas are just as good, but we're not getting the investment. That's what's holding us back, not quality. We need to end this myth that we don't deserve. We're just systemically not getting the resources we deserve. So I'm going to end that conversation there, but the book is not just about businesses, not just about housing. I look at all the assets in our community that we should be investing in, but we're not getting that investment. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this great conversation.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you, Andre. So our other panelists, who I think is really going to help us understand how this stuff looks on the ground level here in Oakland, specifically East Oakland, is June Grant. June is a founder and design principal at Blink Lab Architecture, a boutique research-based architecture and urban design practice. She's a member of the Black Cultural Zone and the current president of the San Francisco chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects, a 50-year-old national organization of Black, Indigenous, and people of color architects, designers, and activists. And June's going to help us understand what does this actually look like when we're talking about Black neighborhoods and sort of the way they're devalued and how that shows up in East Oakland and what the Black Cultural Zone is trying to do about that to put some of that value back. June?
Thank you, Ernest. I am really, really looking forward to a conversation. So I'm going to just spend 5 minutes on BCZ and just frame it because I see we have 227 participants on this call. So as Ernest said, my name is June Grant and I wear several hats, but the one I'll wear tonight is representing the Black Cultural Zone Collaborative. And the Black Cultural Zone is exactly what it says. It's a collaborative of residents and businesses focused on historically Black communities, particularly East Oakland. That's where it's really gotten its foundation. The membership includes churches as well as government agencies, as well as medical facilities, pretty much anyone who's interested in the health, wealth, and security of African Americans in East Oakland. And their purpose, and I'm just gonna read their statement because this group is incredible in its innovation. Their purpose is to innovate, incubate, inform, and elevate the community through community-driven projects that allow our people, i.e. Black people, and culture to thrive. And their basis is a cooperative model, not a membership-based model. It's one where I have been a member or loosely associated for maybe 2 years, and I've watched this group grow in its focus. I have watched it be very strategic in its decisions. And so they have identified 4 primary priorities: placekeeping, which we're going to talk about, Andre, this term placekeeping, arts, cultural preservation and innovation, economic development, and quality of life. And one of the things, even though quality of life is listed as their 4th item or their 4th priority, it actually is part of every single conversation that I have participated with the group. And I see that it's actually a thread that guides every conversation, every decision that's made by the collaborative. So their values are people, culture, place, love, safety, and health, as well as, it's a long list, creativity, economy, and freedom. And one of their core projects is actually creating a hub, a Black Cultural Zone hub. And this goal of identifying a site where Black culture can thrive and where services and support is available and easily identifiable is important because we're seeing this desire to have a Black cultural identity in several cities. We're seeing it in Seattle, we're seeing it in Detroit, we're seeing this idea for Africa Town per se play out increasingly across the US. And so in East Oakland, the group, which is both membership of millennials as well as elders, very, very focused on having a unified voice, a voice where everyone's opinion is heard. And they've done tremendous work in making sure that all the voices are raised and treated equally. And so it is this group that I represent tonight in this discussion. And so I kind of first wanna talk about if everyone has, I'm not assuming everyone's bought the book, but my nose is, as you can see from all the yellow stickies in it, I've been deep in the book. And what I love about this book is that it's story driven. So it makes it easier for us to really deal with the hard questions and issues that some of it heartbreaking, Andre. But it's the reality that we experience. And so I want to just first acknowledge one of your chapters, and I want to make sure I get it right, because it's the one about it's time to elect a Black female president.
Yes.
And the announcement today of Kamala Harris being selected as to run with Biden for presidency and vice president. So let's talk about that particular chapter. And we're writing on the history of Shirley Chisholm. And we're seeing that we're getting closer and closer to that day. So can you frame out that chapter for us? Because I have to say, I haven't finished it because I have many notes on the side.
Well, you know, in many ways, it is playing itself out right now. That I wrote the chapter actually wanting to see a Black woman president, because the data in the chapter, it shows how Black women are rising in almost every area. When you're talking about culture, it's, you know, Beyonce, Oprah, and Michelle are the new Black Trinity, so to speak. And when you're talking about education, the higher proportion of Black women are going to school than other groups in this country. When you're looking at professional growth, Black women are rising up the ranks. However, when you look at pay, they're not getting pay that they deserve. When you look at physical abuse, Black women are not being protected by police and other agencies. When you just look at political representation, Black women are not represented. So for me, the way to achieve that representation is through political representation. So when Black people get elected, that's what we need. What's interesting about that chapter, you see Black women getting elected in areas where they are not the majority, showing their value. So, I mean, in London Breed in San Francisco, for instance, really represents people who are getting elected in areas you're not expecting victory.
Yeah,
And
they're
so,
only 3% of the population.
that's exactly right. That's right. But Black women transcend because they have a vantage point where they see what it means to be overly incarcerated. They know what it's like to be underpaid, but they also are in the boardrooms. So they have an extreme crossover appeal, and they've done the work for both parties, but mainly for Democrats over the years without getting the reward. If you look at Alabama, the special election a few years back, it was Black women that got Doug Jones elected. The Black women of the Get Out the Vote movement in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Mobile, and they rallied to get Doug Jones elected. The reality is that could have very well been a Black woman who took that seat. When you look at Stacey Abrams in Georgia, she should have won that race if it wasn't for voter suppression. And then in Louisiana, when John Bel Edwards was up against his Trump-supported challenger, it was the Black mayors of New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Shreveport that delivered before John Bel Edwards. It's time that Black women get the due, and so for me this is important. But let's not lose sight of the highest office in the land.
Oh, yeah.
That we need Black women. Again, Black women are powerful, but they are not protected.
But the part of the chapter that I really appreciate, there are many points, but in that chapter where you point out in the American Values Survey that racial inequality ranked amongst the least important issues for white men and women. But what happens when we are elected to these positions is that we now have the opportunity to bring it to the forefront, which is what happened with Stacey Abrams. It was as a result of her loss that this issue about voter representation, voter rights, being very present, being able to raise all these issues that we have not been able to make. Well, her loss resulted in a paradigm, a leapfrog of the issues to come forward. We were no longer inching along. It was there.
Absolutely. You know, Black women are carrying the progressiveness of the Democratic Party. Let's be clear about that.
Yeah, I know.
You know, and so they're carrying that the political meat for Democrats in so many different ways. But so it's time. It's time that they get their just due. You know, again, it's nice that Kamala Harris, Senator Harris, is getting this nod. in recognition that of Black women's contributions overall. But I'm not satisfied till we see a Black woman in that seat.
We want it all.
Yes.
I'm very clear about that. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot back to my original script, which was, and so the audience knows how I want to have the conversation was two primary buckets. The first bucket is a demand to reform our system, which is more about policy. And the second bucket, which is later in the conversation, about demanding change. And the reason why I wanted to focus on these two buckets is because I'm representing BCZ in this conversation. They're a very proactive group. And one of the things that has come up for BCZ as we look at buying property and trying to get loans is the realization that our properties are undervalued because it's predominantly Black or Latino neighborhood. And so one of the questions I had was, is it possible, because typically urban planners will issue a zoning map, they'll show you housing footprints, but isn't it time we start to also lay in comparisons to show where the policies themselves are skirting the responsibility about daylighting the inequities that are being experienced on the ground? You were able to take the data and show it.
Yeah.
It's time that the people who are hired to work in the city government actually do similar.
Yeah, I mean, and we have the capacity to do it. I certainly encourage everybody to go buy my book, Know Your Price. But you can also download, or you can look what's going on in your city, in your area, by going to the valuation of Black assets on the Brookings site. You can, and you can scroll over your area to see the actual numbers. But the reality is that many community leaders should be using this data to return the value that's been extracted by racism back in the form of microloans and grants and other support systems, so that Black people can have the discretionary funding that they would have had in the first place if there wasn't racism. You know, a lot of gentrification has occurred because we just don't have the discretionary income to keep up with rising taxes, to keep up with rising cost of living. If we just got what we deserved, we wouldn't have this problem. And so you're right, we should be using data to pinpoint or to show where there are disparities in pricing. And by the way, not only are homes in Black neighborhoods priced lower, they are also, Black people are also taxed more. And so the tax assessments are often higher. So we're getting this Black tax on both ends, and it's really hurting us in multiple ways. But you're right, we should be using data to show the inequalities that that need to be redressed.
So you tell the story, and can you tell the story about why the book was titled the title?
Oh, yeah.
Because your story, the relationship between August Wilson, of course, a hero in my eyes, is so telling of a Black experience. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, my favorite play in the whole wide world is Two Trains Running by the great August Wilson from my hometown in Pittsburgh. In the play, the main character, Memphis, is about to have his property seized through eminent domain by the city of Pittsburgh. The city, and this actually happened, the city of Pittsburgh offered the main character, Memphis, $15,000 for the property. The main character, knowing is worth more than that, so he said, no, I'm not selling my property for $15,000. I got my price, I know my price, and I'm paraphrasing. But it's a refrain throughout the play as he goes back and forth through the city. I got my price, I know my price. There's another character, Hambone, who paints a fence in exchange, what he thought in exchange for a ham. So he paints the fence for this proprietor, but he never gets his ham. And throughout the play he goes, give me my ham, give me my ham. And we don't know if he has mental illness before he paints the fence, but he eventually goes crazy and eventually dies. Now, there's a happy ending. I know people are like, wow, that's depressing. But the main character, Memphis, eventually gets $35,000, which is considered market rate or the white rate. But the moral of the story is you got to know you have worth.
Yeah.
But what my book tries to do is give folks the price to stand on, even if it means going crazy and dying. We've got to mobilize in such a way that we know our worth and our value, and we're willing to step out on the price that we deserve. So that's the thrust of the book, and that's what I want people to get out of it. Hey, my job as a think tank scholar is to give people information so that they can create the change we need. And so I want to be a part of that.
But then what is fascinating to me is that a developer or an investor does know. That's why they're investing in that space. And what is fascinating to me is, and we can talk about opportunity zones a little bit, but before we get to opportunity zones, I want to touch on the part where you talk about when it comes to white neighborhoods or investment, they invest in the person. But when it comes to Black neighborhoods, it's called urban development. You must develop the space. You're not investing in the person. You must develop the space. And everyone who knows me knows I have an issue with the term urban planning. I wish we would find some other term for it. But let's talk about this. This fact that when it comes to Black neighborhoods, it's suddenly urban development and what that means.
Well, what's interesting when it comes to Black communities, we're constantly investing in brick and mortar. We're investing in inanimate objects, and when you invest in place and not people, you get gentrification. You jack up the prices eventually rise, incomes don't, investment in people don't, and they are no longer able to afford this. No one knows this better than the folks in Oakland, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And so, but what I wanted to show, but when it comes to white people and white developers, people are investing in their dream and them. Mm-hmm. They want to make them rise, and what comes out of the wash in that are you see wealth generation amongst white community, white business leaders. And you don't see it in Black people. Again, we have got to invest in people first. That's the goal. Invest in people, places will develop. And I love what you guys are doing with the Black Cultural Zone, is because we need to center Blackness in a way that allows us to see ourselves, to be free. And I talk a lot about in the book, there's a section I talk about Afrofuturism, to explain that we need cultural spaces that are about us, not about a reaction to us, not about a negative view of us, but who we are and our potential. Oh, yeah. And so we need to, and you get that by investing in people who have vision, who have a love for community. And so that's what we also need to do.
But I want to also bring up now Brian Rice.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know his story until maybe a few days before I was asked to do this. And I'm not sure why his story flashed across my screen. But when you talk about investing in people versus investing in place, with Brian, it's a little bit of both. Talk to the audience about Brian's story.
Yeah, I have a chapter. I have a chapter on this where people will appreciate. It's called "Buy Back the Block," and that's what he did. He literally, because in some areas, not quite on the West Coast, but particularly in the Midwest, the South, and the East, there are lots of places you can literally buy the block with family and friends dollars. And that's what he did. He went and bought 9 buildings on an entire block. And he partially developed them with the family friends dollars. He went to go get a loan to finish developing the properties. and they appraised the properties at essentially $0, which makes no sense. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. They used abandoned gas stations as comps for many of the buildings, which didn't make any sense at all, except for they didn't want him to develop that area. He was developing an area for the Black community so that they could have the grocery store, so they could have the social services. He also wanted high net growth businesses as well. He wanted tech companies and other things that develop revenue at a high level. But when he designed a plan to uplift the Black community around this commercial corridor, and he can't get the investment. It's now, and I really want people to look this up. Again, you can go buy the book, Know Your Price, but his story is now becoming a worldwide story of how it's so hard for Black people to get the kind of investments they need in order to see growth. So it's an incredible story. Look up Brian Rice. You can actually tweet him. I think his Twitter is Brian K. Rice, Brian K. Rice on Twitter. Send him a little shout out, say Andre Perry's giving him a shout out and to support that brother.
So one of the reason why I bring him up is CDFIs, the financial instruments that might have helped, or the ones that are most likely to be available to Black communities. Because we know the national banks, the large banks are not going to, I'm not even going to say least likely, not going to provide a loan at a fair rate. So did a CDFI help him, or what was there a role that was played in the CDFI? Or maybe you could explain to the audience what a CDFI is. Yeah,
community development financial institutions are very much like banks, but they offer products that are supposed to bridge these equity gaps. That's what they're supposed to. But in reality, but the reality is many of the rules and regulations are very similar to banks. But the problem was there was not a lot of CDFIs in the area in which he is in. So and overall, we know this from the PPP loan fiasco, we need to build capacity of CDFIs all across the country, because we know it's the historic devaluation of Black lives that reduce the amount of wealth in Black communities. A lot of people know that the median wealth for white families is about $170,000. The median wealth for Black families is $17,000. But that's not because of anything we're doing. That was because of policy. Policy created that. Again, there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. So what we have to do is figure out ways to increase investment in people like Brian Rice. Nothing grows without investment. Absolutely. So if they're trying to put us in all these different programs, financial literacy, and this makes no sense. Like my business data shows, we know how to run businesses, we know how to run homes. We're just not getting the investment capital. So we got to demand the investment dollars so that our communities can grow.
You raised something in the book which I had not thought about, but has been in the back of my mind a question. And many may not know, I used to be a financial analyst. So I used to look at annual reports daily. And a couple things have been on my mind. The difference between an incubator and an accelerator. And you brought it up almost in the same paragraph when you mentioned clusters and clustering. And I bring these three up: clusters, incubator, accelerator, for many reasons. Because what I will hear whenever there's talk about development in the Black communities, we're going to create an incubator. But when you want to talk about, this is in San Francisco, typically by bro in a plaid shirt and long black beard, it's an accelerator. And this difference has been needling at me for some time, but you kind of brush against it in the book, but you don't really dive into that there's also a race question around those two terms. Do you think there is?
Well, certainly there's not a lot. Accelerators are generally have you're in this, you're part of it's like an incubator where you're in a facility in which you are asked to build your company up. Accelerators generally come with an investor investing in your company and getting a return on that investment. They own a part of your company, and they give you a timeline to essentially launch or develop your company.
In Jamaica, we call it backative.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And then but in an incubator is generally a work sharing place where there is some cohabitation going on and cross-pollination. It doesn't necessarily have to have investment. You can just be a tenant in a space. But it's clear that Black folk aren't invited to some of the most high profile accelerators in the country. And it's a shame. Now, I think there's a lot to be said about venture capital in a sense of it's not, I mean, it's not the big thing that drives well. I mean, it really is operating on a small number of businesses in the grand scheme of things, but it's symbolic of how we look at Black people and Black businesses. There's just not the same level of investment and enthusiasm towards Black businesses, but we're literally taking or spending money, giving, as you say, the bros, millions and millions of dollars for these ideas, and you're like, yo, can a brother get $1? Yeah. You know, it's just mind numbing.
Your story about was it your school that what became?
Yeah. So my school, so this is another thing. Many Black communities, especially.
And let me frame it a little bit for the audience, because the reason why I raised the question is Oakland has a lot of half-used schools. They're not completely empty. We're in the process of shifting the students to co-locate. We're in the process of determining, do we sell some of these schools? Do we lease them out? Is there any kind of economic value to these schools? And it's a painful question and a very painful conversation, and that's going on in Oakland right now. And your story about what became of the school is probably instrumental to Oakland as a story. And I'd love you to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just schools, but there are municipal buildings that we should be converting. But schools are important because they are conveniently located in areas that are walkable, that can hold traffic. They're community-driven enterprises. So it's places where there's history, people know them. And if a school-age population drops, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not educational services still needed. There's not community services still needed. So instead of converting these properties into high-rise lofts or expensive properties, we should be investing in them and converting them into things that we can use. You know, my old school, Johnston Elementary, as I feature in the book, it became more of a community serving incubator. So the businesses in that facility actually are community driven. So there's dance organizations and things for kids and community services in that building. I'm also interested in making sure that we convert schools to meet the educational needs of adults as well, because sometimes it's the school age population might decline, but there's still educational service needed in the community.
Especially so today with COVID,
That's exactly right. We need the space.
We need the space. And it's a place for especially the elder to learn about the services, because many only have a small phone. They don't have a computer at home. So we do need these spaces for education for the elderly as well as workforce development.
And so our municipal leaders, instead of selling these properties off to the highest bidder, they should be figuring out ways to convert them into other public goods that everyone can use. But that's just another form of an asset. So when I talk throughout the book, I show, hey, you know, we can easily convert these assets in ways that advance the Black community, but we typically don't do that because you know why.
Yeah, but the part of the story I like, and I'm still questioning the financial viability, I point that out, is that the group, what was it, Community Fort? I forgot the name of the organization.
Yep, that's right, Community Fort.
And they decided to rent space to the extreme pogo firm, and I'm assuming that's full market rate, and then they subsidized the community service organizations. So in their rent, their rents were lower. And I really like that model because it started to demonstrate how you integrate market rate and a marketable business that could scale in that space, but also be able to maintain a space for dance and art and other businesses that could be incubated within the school building itself or premises. Although you do point out that the owner of the whole project is not making a dime on this, and that he's really teaching, I think, at Carnegie Mellon. But he created a model that's worthwhile investigating, and I found that to be really, really encouraging, because we have so many schools here that we are not sure what to do with.
Absolutely, I think it's a great model. I love the way that the owner, Michael Skirpin, is creating a way to create equity in terms of who's renting and a way to pay for itself. But it's hard. If the pogo stick company, the extreme pogo stick, believe it or not, that those things exist, and it's they are housed at Community Forge, but it's paying, essentially subsidizing the other rents. And so, but that's a great model.
That's a great model.
We should be replicating it.
Yeah, I agree. I see that it's...
June,
do we have questions?
do you mind if I hop in with a few audience questions?
Go ahead.
Cool. So one that came up a few times in the Q&A is for this question of where do renters fit into this piece? So I mean, the concept of valuation assumes you own. If you don't own anything, you're not part of that equation either way necessarily. And there's this risk of if you're making any kind of improvements in a neighborhood and the rent's going up and your income is not, you're being pushed out. How do we see renters fitting into sort of even a more positive vision of that change?
Well, critics will say that the devaluation allows for lower rents overall. But as you know, that when there's devaluation, white people who move in a Black neighborhood are essentially getting a discount. And so what always ends up happening in areas where there's devaluation, homes get bought out. That's why we need a robust home ownership program that enables people who've lived in a particular neighborhood or area for a significant period of time by renting, to use that history as a way to get people into a home of some kind. Now, it's not necessarily the same in Oakland as it in, let's say, Detroit, but in Detroit, believe it, I mean, folks will their jaw will drop. But there's thousands of abandoned properties that are priced under $30,000 that banks won't back in terms of a mortgage because it's too low. We just simply need new loan products that enable someone who works in a grocery store to own a home. That's what should be. And so what I'm actually proposing, and I want folks to know this, I'm actually working with the Ashoka organization. I need people to follow me, also follow me on Twitter at Andre Perry EDU. But follow me on Twitter, because we'll be announcing sometime in the fall a competition where we'll be asking people to vie for $1 million in essentially grant money to work on these issues. And so we'll be asking for people to develop new products, new policies, and we will incentivize. So the only thing is, we want you to be proximate to the problem. So we don't want you to be, somewhere away. We want you to be you want people who have a stake in this issue. And so, but look out for that. But the goal is, we need to encourage ownership, because when you own, you're not worried about gentrification. When you're an owner, you want folks to the population to rise, development. You want these things. And so the goal for me is, how do you create more owners? And it doesn't necessarily have to be ownership in the traditional sense of a single family and a single family home. We need alternative models where cooperatives, for instance, that also can enable people to own. So we're looking for alternatives to the current situation that will enable people to actually have a stake in their community. More of a stake, I should say.
June, did you want to talk about any of the work BCZ is doing around home ownership? No, it's the ADU question.
I want to touch on that a little bit because we have such a national audience. The primary group, and I see Makita just put it on there, EBPREC, the East Bay Property, I'll always get it wrong, but let's just say it's
East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative.
Thank you. And the model is a cooperative ownership model, but it's for-profit, not for-profit. So it's a for-profit membership-based cooperative model. And the beauty of this organization, in addition to taking the land off the market, getting tenants to be able to finally own somewhere, is of course the ability to grow wealth over time. There are pros and cons to the model, but what I'm really enjoying seeing is, originally it started out as being advertised about home ownership, but also our commercial spaces became gentrified. And so the organization has also pivoted to include commercial business ownership, which is key because our commercial corridors also become expensive over time. Which is an interesting story in Birmingham, where that neighborhood that Brian's in was a very vibrant neighborhood, but very few of the businesses actually owned the buildings.
Right,
and that part of the story was really revealing and tells us why we also need to own the commercial strip as well. But to get back to EBPREC a little bit, is what we're seeing is individuals actually deed over their existing highly valued home to EBPREC with the understanding that it should be kept for a particular section of the market, say teachers or art teachers or dancers. And that's beautiful to see that we're challenging the model about ownership of land and ownership of real estate. And I find that to be really inspiring. So I'm glad that, that you brought up the question about tenancy, but also to broaden it to say it goes beyond the home ownership. It also includes the business, and there are various models that you can go through. And then the thing about ADUs in this question for me, I know Ernest, with the best of intention, brings it up, but the question in-law units maps back to access to finance, because in order to build this second unit, you have to have A, great valuation on your property, B, a bank that's willing to lend you funds, and C, what is that rate that you will now be charged for the loan? And so we're, that question about demanding change, but also reforming policy is adamant. We do need more transparent systems to evaluate some of the banking loans and the banking practices. Otherwise, we will still be fighting. But at the same time, we have to demand the change, as you're saying. Without us demanding, it's not going to happen. So that's where I really appreciate your statement that we must demand change.
Know your price. Gotta know your price.
You gotta know your price. You gotta know your price. What are the questions?
In that vein of demanding change, I hope a lot of the folks on this call are YIMBY Action members, and I hope more of you will be YIMBY Action members after the call. But we're really into policy change. We're into demanding changes. So, but let's pick a level of government, right? So local government, your city council. As we think about this last hour's conversation, what should we be asking of our city councils? Put state and federal a little bit out of the picture. They have roles in this too. But what the city councils owe us as we walk down this path?
Oh man, let me be clear. City municipalities are still the largest landowners in most places, and they can actually zone for affordability, zone for new ownership models, zone for different kind of commercial corridors. Unfortunately, many leaders take the easy route and sell off land for essentially for little, because politically they're going to get a contribution, and also they're going to see quote unquote economic growth quickly, because you know that in some areas you can get wealthy people to move in and displace others. And so at some point we need leaders to lead and demand. We need leaders who also know their price and are not willing to sell out for wealthy people and essentially sell out for community. You know, we need integrated, rich spaces. And when I say integrated, I'm talking particularly socioeconomically. You know, there was a time where I could go to a barber shop and I could see all of a community, you know, and that's changing. That is changing. You know, you just don't have that kind of cross-pollination of classes in the same space anymore. Places are pushing out poor people, and poor people, when they come in the city now, it's only to work. Well, you know, we should not just exploit labor. We should want people to be neighbors. And for me, it is also about government, city councils, creating the zones that enable low-income residents to actually own, to actually be a part of change. But that just takes leadership. And, you know, but leadership is wanting in many places across this country.
June, you got any policy asks coming from East Oakland?
You know, I had so many images in my mind, and I think my biggest policy ask, if I'm going to frame it, is when you told the story about Google coming to Philly and the divide between Pittsburgh and the neighboring city, Wilkinsburg, and how there didn't used to be a division between the two cities. And then once Google came in and the city decided to develop and incentivize an innovation zone, how that created basically a geographic wall between the two cities.
Yeah.
And that is something I see actually playing out in Oakland. And I have a fear that it will also play out at West Oakland, because West Oakland is the first stop outside of San Francisco. And the desire there too is to attract the tech companies. But what you point out is, while the tech workers increase and service workers increase, the salaries, the wages of the service workers actually fell by 20% in Pittsburgh. And that's a danger. That's for me was a policy that brought that change. And my question is, what is the alternative? Because I see you propose a community planning strategy, a community mindset. And so I wonder what that would have looked like had it been applied to Pittsburgh.
Oh, I mean, this goes to like the Amazon competition that occurred, what was it, last year, 2 years ago, whatever. You know, mayors need to play their own gambit, their own game, and demand that if you want to have your company in your neck of wood, it has to benefit everyone. We should not give away the farm, meaning give all kind of tax incentives to companies just and when they land that the wages are not increasing for the residents who are already there. If you can't show how your contributions in taxes and in the development of a community is going to improve the people already there, then it's not worth bringing that the business there. And so it's hard for people to hear that because everybody wants essentially development. But often development doesn't develop the people, you know, who are already there. So, you know, so I've been saying, hey, we need to stop these gambits of giving away our taxes and giving away our benefits. That has to stop because it's not helping regular people who are already there.
On that note.
This was fun. And we've gone through the hour, so we should do this again in some fashion. So I'll do the outro real quick. So thanks Andre, thanks June for sharing your time and insights with us. Folks on the line, if you enjoyed this conversation, I urge you to join YIMBY Action, links in the chat, and join our movement to help create communities that do what we're talking about here, right? This isn't going to happen. There's some action. It's going to take a lot more than listening to these very wise words. You got to get out there and do it. And we're actually holding our next conversation in this series on August 26th with Aldous Brooks, former Denver City Councilman. So we're going to keep this conversation going. So again, thanks Andre, thanks June, and we'll see you the rest of y'all in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Andre. I'm enjoying
the book. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Go get Know Your Price.
Buy the book.
Buy the book.
Buy the book.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.